Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world. And so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. Don't forget to go and get yourself that fabulous drink, because you deserve to treat yourself to something effervescent and refreshing. And I just want to thank you for those of you who've bought me coffee. I'm so appreciative. I just only wish that I could have it with you. I really do. And I really regret that there is probably distance between us, but we're together in heart, all of us gathered together listening to a story. It's as if we're around a big fire, and it doesn't matter whether we're in the north or the west or the east or the south. We're all together enjoying a story, and nothing is more special than that, because stories make our lives so much richer. And they're so much better than television programs and stuff like that, because you can lie back, relax, and be transported to another place, another time. And the irony is, we can do this all together, and that's what makes it so special. But before we carry on with the story tonight, what I'd like to say is this is part 2. So if you haven't seen part 1 of the story, go back to it, and let's get started with tonight's story. It had been challenging adjusting to life without his wife, Dawn, but Griffin knew he would manage on his own. His life was fueled by many passions, and although one of them had been fortuitously extinguished, he knew he would pursue his other interests, as there was still life in the old dog yet, and Griffin had much he wanted to live for. He thoroughly enjoyed taking regular walks in the woodgrove, listening to opera music, reading books, turning his hand at something creative in the kitchen, as, believe it or not, Griffin could turn out some excellent dishes when the need arose. One night, as Griffin sat up in his living room, resting his back up casually against the L-shaped couch, with his legs comfortably stretched out before him, he was listening to opera, his favourite being Mozart's The Magic Flute, and Luciano Pavarotti's Rigoletto, while knocking back a delicious glass of high-quality red Pinot Noir, as the cheap stuff went straight to his head, and always brought on one of those ghastly migraine headaches that was almost impossible to shift. Griffin had always adored opera, but after he drank his wine, he began to slip into a deep sleep, with a light blanket covering his legs. Griffin awoke with a start from a deep sleep, shocked to discover that he was still lying on the couch. It was so dark in the living room by now, as the curtains to the sliding doors had not been drawn. So fortunately soft moonlight cast its ethereal silvery shadows across the room, distinguishing the solid familiar features in the living room, from the mantel to the upholstered chairs, the coffee table, the sideboard, all that Griffin knew very well. Even if he was stumbling around in the darkness, he could easily discern roughly whereabouts each item of furniture was actually located. That was when he heard the strange tapping sound. At first it was gentle, but also persistent. And then as he turned to look at the glass sliding door, he nearly jumped out of his skin. There was a dark figure standing there, with its head pressed against the window, looking in at him. It was the scariest thing he'd ever discerned in his life. His first thoughts were, "What the hell is that?" And for a second his blood ran cold. There was a monster standing outside his sliding door, looking directly in at him, and by the dusky, dense silhouette, this thing was easily 8 foot tall, possibly more. For a moment Griffin could not react. It was like his mind was not in alignment with his body, as if there was a disconnection, almost as if his natural reflexes were not firing on all cylinders. Griffin remained frozen, staring at this huge form, looking at him through the window. What the hell is that? He then remembered Don the postman talking about a female Bigfoot. Was this her? And if it was, why was she tapping on his window? What could she possibly want with him? Why was she so eager to get his attention? And most importantly of all, should he be scared, intimidated, desperately afraid? Of course he should. Was this monstrously large creature a threat to his safety, a dangerous liability, a pretentious problem? More than likely. But at this moment Griffin seemed embroiled in a bubble, in which he could not escape. The right thing to do was, of course, to rush forward as quickly as he could and bolt the sliding door, turning the lock in the key, running and hiding under the bed, while calling for the police. But Griffin did none of those things, Griffin was compelled to move forward, inching cautiously across the parquet floor with a hesitant reluctance as he edged apprehensively towards the creature. It was almost as if he was sliding towards her in his loafers, as if the parquet floor had become a skating rink. Once again he could hear her tapping urgently and somewhat impatiently on the glass. When he was half a foot away from the sliding door, he saw the figure indicating to him, as if she was beckoning for him to follow her. For a brief second, Griffin could swear he could hear his wife's voice from beyond the grave speaking to him. "You must follow her, Griffin." And then Griffin did not hesitate. He waved at the creature, whom seemed to be waiting impatiently for him, and went to retrieve a torch. Seconds later, he was following this ambiguous creature into the woodgrove in the middle of the night. Griffin could see she was a Bigfoot as she kept turning around to check that he was indeed following her. The expression on her face was of profound concern, as if something was irking her. Griffin was not certain what he was feeling, as if his emotions were like a kaleidoscope of different thoughts, none of what he could make any sense of. Was he afraid? No, he wasn't afraid. Was he curious? No, not really. But even so, it was like a power beyond his own was grabbing him by the hand into the heart of the woodgrove, so that any rational reasoning had abandoned him. Griffin had never visited the woodgrove at this time of the night before, and was bewildered how different it appeared so late at night. Everything was so tenebrous. The vertical shapes of the trees were like dense cardboard cutouts, everything obscure and indistinct, and the precipitous trail was inundated with jagged rocks that jutted out of the earth's soil, eager to trip you up in a moment's notice. There was a soft wind blowing in the breeze as Griffin followed the Bigfoot, and then she points to a huddled-up bundle behind a bush and looks at him earnestly, as if, "What are you going to do about this?" Griffin realized it's a human form, huddled up into a ball, realizing to his astonishment it's a boy, possibly of 10 years old or more. But what is he doing in the woodgrove at this time of the night, fast asleep, curled up in a ball? "Hello, young man," says Griffin. "Would you like to come back home with me? You can't lie here all night in the woods. I've got some hot chocolate at home, and I think there's some blueberry muffins in the pantry." The boy looks up at Griffin with wide eyes, his face a picture of terror. "Don't send me back to my mummy! Don't send me back to her!" His voice is begging, pleading even. "No one is sending anyone back anywhere," says Griffin. "You can stay with me as long as you like, young man. But if you stay here in the woodgroves, you will catch your death of cold, and that is something I can promise you of. And you will become exceedingly hungry, and that won't do, will it?" The boy agrees, shaking his head. He looks up at Griffin through wide eyes framed by pink blotches that look like he's been crying a lot. He nods, so Griffin takes him by the hand and guides him back to the farmhouse. Griffin turns around and thanks the Bigfoot, who watches them as they leave. "What's your name, young man?" "Robin," he says. "And yours?" "Griffin. My name is Griffin. I'm very pleased to meet you, Robin." Robin's account. I was 12 years old at the time when I knew I couldn't live with my mother a moment longer. Even from a very young age, I knew my mother had mental problems and was exceedingly unstable. When my father had been alive, living with her had been bearable, well, just. Each time we heard my mother having a blowout in the kitchen, my father would lock me up in his study with him, and we'd wait for the storm to subside. Sometimes we would play cards together, or watch something on television in his study. My father's study had a tiny refrigerator that was fully stocked with drinks and snacks, so that we were always prepared for these inopportune emergencies. My mother could be heard throwing around pots and pans in the kitchen, screaming at the top of her lungs. She would use enigmatic, inscrutable words, baffling, incomprehensible expressions that sounded like they were more Latin in origin. I had never heard words like that before, that were as alien as an ancient language. The idiosyncratic voice that emerged from her mouth during these bizarre, inexplicable episodes sounded distinctly male rather than female, almost as if my mother had multiple personalities. When she was in that weird kind of frenzied mood,
When all common sense had fled her, along with her regular fun-loving personality, you knew you needed to get out of the firing line as fast as you possibly could. The kitchen became a bomb site, with pans littered across the floor and scattered above the surfaces. My mother's weapon of choice was always the frying pan, which my dad would say was a jolly good thing. As if it was the breakables that were used during her violent outbursts, we possibly wouldn't have a plate or mug in the house, and be eating off plastic plates and forks. It was funny, but my father's office had become like an air raid shelter to us. The place we would gravitate to the moment we heard the warning sirens of my mother's screeches blowing through the house like a threatening cyclone that you needed to escape. My father would double-bolt the door of his office, pull up an upholstered chair against the door, and we would continue our lives as normal, choosing to forget about what was occurring beyond the safe confines of the office. The only way I can describe it to you is like hiding out from a bombing in a city, and once the all-clear sirens have been rung, you gravitate out of the safe confines of your shelter to see the damage that has been done. In the advent of a real war situation, you would probably see those whose houses were now a heap of rubble, or whose windows had been cracked and badly damaged. In our case, we knew all was safe and well when the house became unusually silent. It was then that my father would creep out to see if the coast was clear. My mother would usually be found lying passed out on the couch, with a frying pan by her side, so my father would lift her up lovingly in his arms and take her back to bed. My father and I would investigate the carnage, but it was always exactly the same, as every frying pan in the kitchen was lying across the floor like a collection of boats clustered together on a stretch of coastline. Sometimes windows would be cracked, parts of the walls bashed in, and pieces of the granite countertop broken off on the edges, while every kitchen cupboard and every door was airily left wide open. Of course, my father had sent my mother to various psychologists over the years, but long-term nothing had ever helped my mother. No diagnosis, no medications, no counselling, absolutely nothing. And many of the psychologists reckoned there was nothing wrong with her at all. But my father and I knew differently. Believe it or not, my mother also desperately wanted help, as she had no recollection of her bouts of anger. Even all these years later, I know it was the tiniest, most unlikely things that would get her started. I knew my father would have left my mother a long time ago. No one would willfully choose to live in such a toxic environment like this. But my father knew he could never leave me in my mother's charge. That would be asking for trouble. Besides, when my mother was compos mentos, my father simply adored her. That was the woman he would struggle to leave. I mean, it was hardly her fault, was it, that she had no recollection of whom she became when she was violently angry. My mother made it clear to my father that if he ever left her, she would fight tooth and nail to keep me, and her chances of keeping me were exceedingly good, as she had not been diagnosed with any mental condition. On the surface, if you met my mother in the supermarket or at a friend's house for dinner, you would have thought she was a regular person, with a great sense of humour. Not for a moment would you have suspected that this petite 100-pound blonde woman was capable of such devastation. Even some professionals that my mother visited over the years for psychological evaluations held a similar view, and seemed heartily convinced that my father was making a mountain out of a molehill, and that my mother was not the liability he claimed she was. But we knew differently. Even my mother tried to persuade them otherwise. She tried to tell them she had a problem, but it would seem people found it hard to fathom that a petite blonde-haired woman, such as the likes of my very benign-looking mother, could potentially be as dangerous as a saber-toothed tiger. Believe me, my mother could be dangerous, in the same way that a storm can be life-threatening. The problem was that when my mother got feverishly mad, she became dissociated from what she was doing, almost as if her body had been hijacked and overtaken by another being, as after her tumultuous manic episode, she had absolutely no recollection or memory of the event, so it really was like she was possessed by a demon or something, as she had missing time. There were many times my father did consider calling the Catholic Church. He did wonder if my mother might be demonically possessed, but regretfully he never pursued that line of inquiry at the time, which in hindsight might not have been a bad idea at all, as even her anger attacks seemed to be relegated to the evenings. When my mother wasn't angry, she was a beautiful, loving person, a world away from the mean, hysterical woman that would become like a rabid dog. It was impossible for most to believe that my mother could be a Jekyll and Hyde personality, but believe me, she was. When my mother was kind to me, she was generously loving and unselfishly giving. I truly felt like the luckiest boy in the world. But when she was angry, she was no longer the mother I knew and loved. She seemed to morph into an animal, a wild animal, as if all compassion and sound reasoning had been confiscated by a menacing, outer-worldly source of some kind. My father always told me that in the advent that something bad was to happen to him, that I was to leave my mother forthwith and go and stay with his brother in the Colorado countryside. He left money in a jar for a taxi, a letter for his brother, a letter for my mother from him, a copy of my birth certificate, and an address for me. I remember him looking at me earnestly in the eyes and saying to me, "Son, you and I know your mother is not well in the head. I don't care how many psychological evaluations she's had. Your mother's behaviour is not normal, and when she's angry, it's not rational. And the worst thing about it all is when she gets like this, she has no recollection of it whatsoever. I want you to promise me, son, that if I die unexpectedly, you will leave this house right away. You will go and stay with my brother. I have the money for a taxi and some extra. You promise me, son, you will go. I know your life is in danger if you stay in this house and I'm not around. If you're left alone with your mother and she lashes out at you with one of those frying pans, she could surely kill you. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?" I had nodded. "But you're not going to die, Daddy, are you?" "Of course not, son," my father had piped, taking me lovingly into his arms. "But as in every situation, you have to be prepared for an emergency. Like when I put smoke detectors up in the house. Suffice to say, I'm not expecting a fire, but I'm prepared in case there is one. It's the same thing. Do you understand, my son?" I had nodded. His request seemed reasonable to me. Of course it would never ever happen, but it gave my father a measure of peace to know that I would be in safe hands should anything bad happen to him. Besides, I knew he was right. Much as I loved my mother, I knew hanging around her indefinitely would not be a good idea if my father was not around. I mean, you might love a domesticated tiger, but is it not going a tad too far if you choose to sleep with it? You could have dangerous repercussions if you made such a bizarre choice. I'll never forget the day I woke up to hear my mother sobbing in my parents' bedroom. She was trying to wake my dad up. She was shaking him vigorously, slapping his face. "Wake up! Wake up!" I could see the tears pouring down her face. I stood in the doorway surveying the scene, at first with a measure of indifference, like a crow on a yard fence. Then I piped, "What's wrong with Daddy? Why's Daddy not waking up, Mummy? I don't understand. Is everything all right?" My mother looks at me through eyes surrounded by pronounced rings of pink. She grabs me into her arms and pipes, "Was Mummy angry last night, sweetheart? Did you see me doing anything to your father last night? Please try to remember. Did Mummy hit Daddy with a frying pan? Try and remember, sweetheart. No, you didn't get angry like that last night. But why? Why's Daddy not waking up?" I ask, the tears pouring down my face. "Why won't Daddy wake up? Why won't he wake up? What's wrong with him, Mummy? Why is he sleeping all the time?" My mother looked relieved, as if she'd been exonerated from having anything to do with my father's fortuitous demise. But even at that young, impressionable age, I could see my dad had been dead for quite some time, well, a few hours at least. It was like his body was now an empty shell. His essence had been extinguished and evacuated from him. The man lying there on the bed, with eyes glazed over like a dead fish, was not my father any more. Well, not the father I remembered. I'd never seen a dead person before. It was exceedingly distressing seeing my dad like that. Of course the coroner arrived on the scene. The body of my father was subsequently taken away. His death was deemed unsuspicious. But why had my dad died so young, without any underlying health conditions? It was more than a little enigmatic, but the coroner had insisted that my father had died of SADS, which is the adult equivalent to SIDS, which is referred to as sudden adult death syndrome, of which there appears to be no definitive cause. Death is deemed unexplainable. My mother was a woman who had few friends, as all her life she'd pushed people away, kept her distance, so she just asked for my father to be buried in a graveyard, insisting there be no funeral. So me and my mother laid down flowers at his grave in our own private personal ceremony. She never even notified family members about his fortuitous death, and informed all his office colleagues that his funeral was a private family affair, upon which none of them were invited. It was about 2 nights later that I quickly scurried into my father's office, slamming the door behind me. I could hear hell breaking loose in the kitchen. My mother began a screaming frenzy in a foreign language. She sounded exactly like a banshee, while frying pans were being violently hurled against the walls. There were bangs, crashes, thuds, thumps, moans, groans, the sound of heavy feet thundering up and down the staircase thousands of times over, like a hamster on a wheel. There were slapping sounds, a strange, curious dragging sound across the floorboards that sounded like a dead body being dragged all over the house. There were shouts and even disembodied shrieks, and for the very first time I felt terribly, terribly afraid. I realised how alone and vulnerable I was. I quickly locked myself in the air raid shelter of my father's office, where we used to hide together from the wrath of my mother, but it no longer felt safe. It was then I remembered my promise to my dad. The following day I organised a taxi to Colorado, which is about 221 miles from Albuquerque, where I lived in the old-time neighbourhood, which was the first neighbourhood ever developed in Albuquerque, and is a haven for art, culture and fine dining. I had lived there for 12 years with my parents, and a simple taxi ride, along with a suitcase of clothes, was all I needed to abandon my old life. I felt nervous about meeting my uncle, and of course his entire family, whom I had met briefly over the years at family events, but arriving on his front doorstep like a stray dog was not something that floated my boat. But I knew my options were running thin, and staying here in Albuquerque with my mother was almost certainly a disaster waiting to happen. I'm glad to say that when the taxi driver dropped me at my uncle's farmhouse in Colorado, after a long drawn-out drive, he didn't ask me any prying, speculative or probing questions. Maybe that was because he wasn't American. He wore a white turban around his head. His skin was a nut brown colour, and he spoke with a strange accent. In truth, he seemed very disinterested in me, and appeared to be preoccupied with someone who kept arguing with him in a strange language on his phone. His wife, perhaps. That's what I suspect, anyway. The only question he asked me was why I was travelling alone. I told him I was visiting my uncle, and thankfully he seemed satisfied with that, and stopped asking me any more questions. Suffice to say, when my mother was out shopping, I had surreptitiously packed my suitcase then and there, and left a letter from my dad for her to read on the sideboard, that my father had told me explained why I was leaving home. He said that what he had written in that letter would almost certainly ensure that my mother would never come after me. I could only hope he was right about this, but to this day I never found out what that letter actually contained. How I would love to know. When the taxi driver dropped me at my uncle's farmhouse, there were chickens pecking the ground, a couple of horses grazing happily in the meadow, but other than that the red-bricked farmhouse was steeped in silence. Everything was locked up and abandoned, almost as if my uncle was away with his family on holiday somewhere. Even the taxi driver commented that no one was at home yet, and he wondered whether I'd be all right. "They'll be back any minute," I told him. "I know they will. They told me they were just doing some shopping in town." The taxi driver seemed satisfied by my proclamations and left me to my own devices, while I waited religiously in the yard for my uncle's family to return home. But there was no sign of any activity. I realised the horses grazing in the field were being attended to by a teenage farmhand, who glanced briefly over his shoulders at me, with a barrel of hay in his hands that he was laying down for the horses. He said, "If you're waiting for the MacFarrows, they're out of the country. They'll be back in a week's time. I'm looking after their horses for them while they're away. Regretfully, you've missed them. You're a week too early. My Aunt Eliza is taking care of their 2 Great Danes, Jules and Jasper, so no one is in, I'm afraid."
"Thanks," I said, my heart sinking. "Where have they gone? Do you know?"
"Scotland, I believe. They're staying in the Highlands with family."
The farmhand kept glancing at me, with a befuddled expression on his face. But when I asked if I could take a shortcut to the town through the woodgrove, he nodded at me, and seemed satisfied that I was making tracks. But he didn't know I'd hidden my suitcase in the family barn, under a barrel of hay. I had clandestinely decided I'd have to sleep there every night until my cousins returned from their vacation. I could only hope they wouldn't be too long, or my money would definitely run out by then.
"Are you Marcus's cousin?" he asked me. "If you don't mind my saying so, I can see the family resemblance very well. You're the splitting image of him. The 2 of you could be brothers. I imagine you're about the same age."
I nodded. "That's right. He's my cousin. We do look awfully alike." Marcus was my cousin. He was approximately my age. But let's just say I'd only briefly met him, at a couple of family occasions, on a couple of sporadic events, so to speak. So know him I certainly did not. I think my father always avoided family interactions and special celebratory events because of my mother's bizarre nocturnal behaviour. I think my father did not want to expose his brother or his family to a woman who could fly off the handle and not even remember it the following day. He knew his brother would have been appalled if he'd seen how we lived, hiding ourselves away in a room like Anne Frank in the attic in the days of the German invasion. It wasn't much different to that.
"He'll be very sorry he missed you," said the farmhand. "Marcus rarely likes his friends. He's a very outgoing social sort. But as I said, you're a week too early. Come back next week. I suppose you must live around here, but I haven't seen you here before."
I nod. I had never felt so alone as I did now. I mean, why did I have to appear on the scene when the whole family had bogged off to Scotland? It was so typical. It could only happen to me. Just my luck. I had Scottish ancestry on my father's side of the family. I didn't have a cell phone with me, so I wasn't certain what I should do. I had some dollar notes available, but other than that, I had absolutely nothing. I knew my cousin Abby and her brother Marcus had told me about walking through a woodgrove on their farm, crossing a couple of roads and coming to the small town, where they swore that they had the best old-fashioned sweet shop you'd ever seen. "It sells sweets from the 70s, my cousin had said. "It sells gobstoppers and gumballs and flying saucers and cola bottles and sour patches and jelly beans and curly-whirly bars that you don't even get today." If I walked through the woodgrove, I might find the road, and subsequently if I got to the small town, I could pick up a little food. And judging by what the farmhand said, it would seem accessing the woodgrove was a great shortcut to the town. I'd have to make my money last a week, so I'd buy something from the bakery every day to keep the grumbles at bay. I waved cordially at the farmhand and walked into the woodgrove, envisaging I would meet the grey ribbon of asphalt pretty soon, whereupon I could find my way easily to the town. I was impressed how clear the earthen path was. I trundled down it late in the afternoon, not even considering looking at my watch for a second. I thought the walk would be pretty straightforward, but that is if you know exactly where you're going, and I didn't. I was soon to discover the trail forked in different directions. I followed the one that snaked straight ahead, but it was like the trail never ended. I was beginning to realize something was terribly wrong. I must have accessed the wrong path. So in the end I had no idea whereabouts I was going. None at all. Unbeknown to myself, I was walking in the opposite direction to the town, and getting terribly lost in the process. It is the most intimidating experience to know that you're alone in a woodgrove, and you don't know how to find your way out of it. I felt as if I was stranded in a maze. It was pretty in the woodgrove, a beautiful afternoon, with the sun filtering through the canopy in soft ribbons of ethereal light that bounced off the viridescent scenery. The path was precipitous, hilly, steep, with rocky appendages jutting out of the rich earthen soil that was furnished with ferns, briars, and pretty ground covers. Then, of course, there were occasional fallen tree trunks that lay scattered across the ground, covered in a plethora of rich green moss. The forest was alive with the chirrups and tweets of pretty birdsong.
I spotted the occasional chipmunk and squirrel darting up the trees, eyeing me curiously through sparkling brown eyes. The trees in the forest, namely ponderosa pines, Colorado blue spruces and Douglas firs, penciled up into the skyline like tall Christmas trees. Time seemed to slip away so fast, like the butter melting on a hot bagel. Before I knew it, I could see the golden glaze of the sunset seeping through the open canopy of the trees, and as beguiling as it was for me, it was a desperately unsettling feeling. If I didn't find my way out of this wood grove, I could be stuck here for the entire night. By this stage, my heart is pounding violently in my chest, as panic impregnates itself into every single cell of my body, causing my mind to become like a jittering, uncoordinated wreck. As in moments of anxiety, when your mind is swept up in a wind of disorientation, it is even more challenging to actually find your bearings. You've got to get out of here, my mind kept shouting to me. It's going to get dark soon. It's going to get dark soon. You could be trapped. You could be trapped. You could be trapped in the forest overnight. In my haste, I made a quick decision to backtrack from whence I'd come, in the hope that I could return safely to my uncle's red-bricked farmhouse. Food was now the last thing on my mind. My appetite had been vanquished by my angst that was bubbling up inside me like a boiling pot of water on a gas hob. I wanted out of here. I wanted out of here now, as soon as possible. Even my body became bumbling and disorientated. I was tripping and slipping all over the forest, over debris, over loose rocks, unsuspecting gnarled roots that hid their traps beneath the soil like predatory fish that pounce out at you unawares, catching you in an unguarded moment. I kept falling all over the place. Then it happened, and it didn't happen slowly. Or if it did, my sense of timing was way off the mark, which was probably the case. The golden glaze of the sun dissipated like the steam from a kettle, and then the sky that peeked through the canopy developed a grey mottled appearance, which deepened drip by drip by drip, until it became tenebrously dark. I was now terribly afraid. There are no words in the English language to describe my state of mind right then. Everything in the forest was now swathed in a deep cloak of inky blackness, so that the once seemingly congenial trees became oppressively menacing as they clustered together in large groups, while a wind whistled through the woods, giving you a bodeful impression that all the trees were conspiring against me. It was probably all in my imagination, of course, but when the light is extinguished, you become hauntingly aware of every single looming dark shadow. It suddenly felt personal, as if the entire world was against me. My father dying so fortuitously, my mother's dangerous, demonic outbursts and weird behaviour, my uncle's family away in Scotland, and now this being innocently trapped in a wood grove. I was struck by the unfairness of my plight. I felt short-changed, as if life had dished me out a double blow. I sat there on the soft, spongy earthen floor, against a tree, my knees cradled up to my chest, my arms holding them tightly inwards. I could feel my eyes glistening with tears. Then I couldn't stop myself. They began to pour down my cheeks, and a choking sound emerged from the back of my throat, which I realized was coming from me. I then began to sob and sob and sob. I'd never been a crier before, more the type of boy that bottled up all my emotions and learnt to keep a stoic, composed look. But here in the forest I fell apart, my choking sobs subduing even the sounds of the crickets and frogs, that were clearly disturbed by the strange interruption to their tuneful chorus. I don't know how long I'd been sobbing for, but then I became very aware that I was not alone. Something was watching me. Something was staring at me. I could feel eyes on me, but in this dark, unilluminated space, I saw nothing. My crying immediately stopped, as a sense of dreadful foreboding overcame me. I considered all the potential predators that could be stalking me right now. I quickly glance around my environment, but see nothing there. But moments later, the light of the moon, that had been concealed by some cloud cover, becomes more visible, as its silvery shafts meander through the leaves. That was when I saw her. At first I thought she was a tree. I hadn't noticed before, a tall stump perhaps, absent of all its foliage. But then I notice its yellow eye shine, and I see the eyes actually twitch. I realise this massive tree trunk is actually a creature. But what is it? The creature is standing so stationary, watching me. But then on realising that I've actually seen her, she breaks away from her frozen posture, like a waxwork statue at Madame Tussauds, miraculously becoming alive, and she moves towards me deliberately. I'm not sure why I wasn't afraid. It could have been something about her eyes, a kind benevolence perhaps, that I subconsciously perceived. But there was a humanness to her gait, and when her face was swathed by a beam of moonlight, I realised the strange anomalous creature was so human, and although enormous, standing up at about 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, and covered with long flowing dark hair, I didn't feel even an ounce of fear or trepidation. On the contrary, I felt a remarkable sense of relief. I was grateful to sense I wasn't alone, and this brought me a measure of reassurance. Then the creature moves towards me, sitting right next to me on the ground, emulating my posture, as she also pulls her legs up to her knees. She is so close to me, sitting only a foot away from me, that I could literally reach out and touch her, and I'm almost tempted to do so. I notice she smells beautiful, like the forest, woody, piney, earthy. Even though nothing is said for a long while, we sit together in the darkness, and I sense I'm with a friend. It's like an all-knowing that comes over me, that this strange idiosyncratic creature actually has my back, and is going to take care of me. For a moment I turn around and look into her eyes. They are filled with a liquid love, submerged in amber gold. She indicates for me to lie down on the ground, near her feet and close to this bush, and that she'll watch over me. I know I can trust her, and in my exhaustion I need little encouragement, so I curl up in a ball next to her feet and fall fast asleep, rather like a dog on the hearth. When I awaken, I find myself looking up into a concerned, somewhat bewildered pair of eyes. It's a man. At first I'm afraid of him, as he references my home. "Don't send me back! You can't send me back!" This hairy female creature, who'd been my companion in the woods, watches everything. She watches me as I interact with this man, who happens to mention hot chocolate and blueberry muffins, and realising how terribly hungry I am, I take the man's strong hand, and he guides me through the woodgrove, with the hairy lady walking behind us, watching our every move. I turn around and wave at her, and then she turns back, gliding into the forest. The old man tells me his name is Griffin. He takes me to his farmhouse. It's too dark to see it in the cold light of day, but I can sense it's a rather big building, with balconies on the upper elevation. Griffin tells me he lives here alone, that his wife died 5 years ago. I feel sorry for him. I can sense he misses his wife a lot, and this big spacious farmhouse must be very lonely for one man. I don't remember much about that night, as I guzzle down the hot chocolate like it was liquid sunshine, and gobble down 2 blueberry muffins, my groaning stomach grateful to be filled. The next morning I woke up late, as my exhaustion had consumed me. I was shocked to see the bedside clock registering 12:30 in the afternoon. I climb out of bed and pull the curtains back to stare out at the countryside. The sunlight has filtered all over the valley, and the views from the window are breathtakingly beautiful. I trot down the sweeping staircase into the kitchen, where Griffin is standing over the hob, cooking something that is making my stomach lurch with hunger. "Hello," I say. "It's Griffin," says the man. "Now tell me, son, are you hungry? I've made my wife's recipe for spaghetti bolognese." "I could eat a horse," I admit. "I hope not literally," says Griffin, offering me a plate of spaghetti bolognese and covering it with flecks of fresh Parmesan cheese. He watches me gobbling up my food and pours me a huge glass of Coca-Cola. "It seems you were a very lucky boy last night, young man. That female Bigfoot came to get me last night. She was the one who showed me your exhausted form lying on the ground under a tree. Jolly good thing. It was a warm night. You can freeze out there in the forest in the cooler months, you know. Do you mind telling me what a young boy like yourself is doing sleeping out in the woods at night like this? Are you running away from home by any chance?" I then begin to tell the old man my story. He listens intently to every word, not saying a thing, just nodding as I talk. "Wow, son, I'm so glad I found you, or more to the point, that hairy lady found you. From what you're telling me, you clearly can't go home to your mother. I don't think your mother has got a mental condition. It sounds like she might be demon-possessed. The Catholic Church should be contacted to perform an exorcism on her. You must stay here until the McFarrows come back. You certainly can't hang around their barns waiting for them to come back. This is your home for as long as you need, son. And I could always do with the company. It gets lonely in this big house of mine, with my wife no longer around. So I'm very glad to have a young man around the place to make things a lot more interesting." I remember the week I spent with Griffin was indeed one of the best weeks of my entire life. He reminded me of my dad. And a couple of days after the McFarrows got back from Scotland, Griffin took me to their farmhouse. I recovered my suitcase from their barn and presented the letter my father had written to my uncle, who read it and shook his head. "Why did my brother keep all this from me? I had no idea this was going on in his marriage. His wife seemed like a decent sort." "Well, I think she might be demonically possessed," says Griffin, "from what your nephew's been telling me. You should contact the Catholic Church to have her condition evaluated. It seems she was never given a clinical diagnosis. This sounds much more like possession to me." "I will be on to it right away," said my uncle, pulling me into his arms affectionately and ruffling my hair. "You know, growing up, me and my brother were as thick as thieves, and we did everything together. But when he married Norma, things changed after that. He became increasingly distant from us. It actually felt we were being snubbed by him. But now I see I got it all terribly wrong. It's easy to get things wrong." "Well, it's easy to jump to wrong conclusions about people," says Griffin, "as not all human behaviour can be fully understood. But it's usually a consequence of what is going on in your home." To cut a long story short, I moved in with my uncle's family, into their Colorado farmhouse, but Griffin became like an uncle to me, and we went fishing together regularly. My uncle's family treated me just like the two other kids, so I was never made to feel like the unwanted son, and even my two cousins regarded me as a sibling. When my uncle went back to Albuquerque to look for my mother, they found scratches all over the wall, lots and lots of blood spatters everywhere, but my mother was nowhere to be found. It was like she had disappeared off the face of the earth. Even though I don't know whether my mother had a mental condition or whether she was demonically possessed, I hope that wherever she is, that she found her peace. I was to learn that the creature that helped me in the woods that night was a Bigfoot, and during my childhood I saw her a handful of times very briefly, where she would nod at me, watch me for a moment, and then dash back into the woodgrove. I always felt safe knowing she was around. I saw her a handful of times very briefly, when she would nod at me, watch me for a long while, and then dash into the woodgrove. I always felt safe knowing she was around, as I knew she had my back, and I believe she would have helped any human being that was in trouble in a heartbeat. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.